This is a deep dive into conversion mechanics in Path of Exile. This time I'm giving the summary at the beginning instead of waiting until after all the in-depth explanations. The feedback and analytics on the hour-long Leech video suggested that this change could be helpful. Also, I've been getting some feedback that the text in my videos has been difficult to read. So far it has been easier for me to handwrite the text, but I'll suck it up and use a proper font this time. Please leave any feedback about this in the comments. Here's the quick rundown of how conversion works. Conversion raises the base value of one stat by a proportion of the base value of another stat. A modifier qualifies as conversion if and only if it uses the words converted to or gain as extra. The former makes you lose the converted amount from the original stat, but the latter does not cause this loss. If multiple modifiers convert from the same stat, those modifiers are additive with one another. Whenever converted to modifiers attempt to convert more than 100% of a given stat, the conversion percentages are scaled down so that you only convert 100%. This downscaling occurs in two steps. Initially, priority is given to conversion from the active skill and its support gems. Then, all other sources of conversion work with what's left. It is possible to convert multiple times in series, meaning you can convert X to Y, then convert Y to Z. Conversion follows specific sequences that must be obeyed to prevent infinite conversion loops. Every time a stat is converted to a new stat, the new value that comes from conversion inherits the ability to scale with modifiers to the old stat. For example, Energy Shield converted from life is affected by modifiers to life and modifiers to Energy Shield. This also applies to converting multiple times, so that modifiers can be passed down more than once in a conversion chain. The most commonly utilized form of conversion is damage conversion, which has its own nuances. Damage tends to roll between a minimum and a maximum value, so the actual proportions of damage dealt will vary from the expected proportions. Modifiers that prevent you from dealing certain damage types, such as the one given by Avatar of Fire, apply after conversion, not before conversion. Damage conversion occurs on the attacker side of combat calculations, before the defender's stats get factored in. Consequently, mitigation and any combat calculations done after mitigation, such as leech and stun, will also be done after conversion. Only damage from hits can be converted. Damage over time cannot. For instance, converting physical damage to cold damage will not turn physical damage over time into cold damage over time. Although damage over time cannot be converted, because conversion alters base damage, it can weaken or amplify ailment effects, including damaging ailments, like bleeding. Furthermore, when converted damage inflicts a damaging ailment, the ailment damage inherits generic modifiers to the original damage type. For instance, if you convert physical damage to fire, and that fire damage inflicts ignite, the subsequent ignite can be scaled by generic physical damage modifiers, but not modifiers to physical damage over time. Similarly, whenever base damage of one type directly inflicts an ailment that deals a different type of damage, generic modifiers to the original damage type will apply to the ailment damage. For example, poison inflicted by physical damage benefits from generic physical damage modifiers. Likewise, ignite inflicted by lightning damage through Stormfire can be scaled by generic lightning damage modifiers. This interaction is not technically conversion, but it shares with conversion the behavior of inheriting damage modifiers. Conversion is typically used for some combination of the following reasons. Maybe your build converts stat X to stat Y because it values Y more than X, but it's easier to get base X than it is to get base Y. Alternatively, perhaps converting X to Y just opens up more scaling options and lets you be more efficient with gear and passives. In the case of gain as extra modifiers, maybe you already invest heavily in X and want to get some of stat Y by piggybacking on that investment. Lastly, perhaps you're playing a skill that already partially converts damage, so you might as well invest more into conversion to make scaling more efficient and also avoid reflected damage. This marks the end of the summary and the beginning of the deep dive sections of the video. Feel free to keep watching, or skip to whatever section is relevant to you. So what exactly is conversion? In Path of Exile, conversion applies a proportion of the base value of one stat to the base value of another stat. A modifier counts as a conversion modifier if it uses the phrasing X converted to Y or gain X as extra Y. There are some modifiers that sound very similar to conversion, but do not count as conversion. These include X damage taken as Y, grants Y equal to X, modifiers to X also apply to Y, and some others. All of these are different from conversion and should not be confused with it. If the description does not contain either converted to or gain as extra, it's not conversion. The gain as extra type of conversion used to be phrased added as, but this wording was phased out to be more precise. Now, the term added damage refers only to modifiers that specifically say they add damage. Gaining damage through gain as extra modifiers does not make it added damage. This is important whenever the game refers to added damage. Most notably, skill gems have a parameter called effectiveness of added damage, which was renamed from damage effectiveness to prevent confusion. Added fire damage support is a vestige of the old retired phrasing of gain as extra modifiers. The description of the gem has been updated, but the name of the gem has not. This is confusing, so hopefully we'll see this changed at some point. To explain how conversion works, let's look at some examples. Although many stats in Path of Exile can be converted, the most prominent form of conversion is damage conversion. Damage conversion allows you to change the base damage of a hit from one type, such as physical, to another, such as lightning. I will focus on damage conversion for the initial examples, because it's what most of you are primarily interested in. Conversion of other things will be covered later in the video. Let's say you have no damage modifiers, and hit an enemy with 100 to 200 base physical damage. Note here that by base physical damage, I don't just mean the local damage of your weapon, or the damage listed on the skill gem. Added damage, such as from this prefix on rings, adds base damage. Thus, the 100 to 200 base physical damage used in this example could be from a combination of local weapon damage and global added physical damage modifiers. This is important because conversion does apply to damage added by global modifiers. With that out of the way, let's say you have a modifier granting 50% of physical damage converted to lightning damage. Now, the physical damage becomes 50% physical and 50% lightning. The skill will instead deal 50 to 100 base physical damage and 50 to 100 base lightning damage. Each of these damage types will roll independently within its respective range. For example, one hit may deal 70 physical damage and 80 lightning damage. The next hit might deal 90 physical and 50 lightning. In other words, essentially, damage conversion applies separately to minimum and maximum damage values, not to the final damage rolls. Multiple modifiers that convert from physical damage will stack additively. If you have both 50% of physical damage converted to lightning damage and 50% of physical damage converted to fire damage, the previous scenario would yield 50% lightning damage and 50% fire damage. Notice that the game does not convert 50% to one element and then convert 50% of what's left. The percentages add together for a full 100% conversion, so that you no longer deal physical damage. If you attempt to convert more than 100% of a given stat, the game will scale down conversion percentages so that you only convert 100%. However, the way the game handles this step can be pretty confusing. In order to properly explain this, I need to make a distinction between conversion from skills and conversion not from skills. Conversion from skills refers to conversion that comes from either the active skill you're using or any support gems linked to it. Conversion not from skills refers to global conversion from item mods and passives. The difference between skill conversion and non-skill conversion matters because when you convert more than 100% of one damage type to other types, and the game must adjust this down to 100%, skill conversion is handled before non-skill conversion. This is best explained through a bunch of examples. Let's take the previous scenario involving 50% lightning conversion and 50% fire conversion, and increase both percentages to 60%. Because these now add up to 120%, an adjustment is necessary to scale this down to 100%. However, exactly how that adjustment is done depends on which portions of conversion come from skills and which do not. Let's start by assuming all of this conversion comes from skills, which means it is handled before non-skill conversion. Conversion from skills then exceeds 100%, so it must be adjusted. In order to preserve the proportion of lightning damage to fire damage, each of these conversion percentages is divided by 1.2, so that you deal 50% of the original physical damage as lightning and 50% as fire. Non-skill conversion follows, but you have none, and there is no physical damage left to convert anyway. Now let's assume that none of this conversion comes from skills. First, conversion from skills occurs, but you have none, so nothing happens. Next up is non-skill conversion, which sums to 120%. This exceeds the 100% of physical damage that remains to be converted, So the percentages are again divided by 1.2, giving 50% of physical as lightning and 50% as fire. This is exactly the same result as the previous example. The takeaway here is that if there is no mixture of skill and non-skill conversion, the same result is achieved from this conversion scaling. Now let's say that the 60% conversion to lightning is from a skill, but the 60% to fire is not from a skill. First, the lightning skill conversion takes place, ignoring the fire conversion. This means that 60% of physical damage is immediately converted to lightning damage, and 40% remains physical. Then, the fire non-skill conversion is handled, and this 60% conversion exceeds the 40% that remains unconverted. Therefore, the 60% is scaled down to 40%, resulting in 60% lightning and 40% fire. Just to really drive this point home, let's include an additional modifier converting 20% of physical damage to cold damage, keeping the 60% lightning conversion from skills, and the 60% fire conversion not from skills. We now convert 140% of physical damage, which must be scaled down to 100%. The final conversion percentages will depend on whether the cold conversion comes from skills or not. If the cold conversion comes from skills, it is handled at the same time as the lightning conversion, immediately converting 60% of physical to lightning and 20% to cold. Then, the 60% fire non-skill conversion exceeds the remaining 20% and is scaled down to 20%. We thus end up with 60% lightning, 20% cold, and 20% fire. If the cold conversion does not come from skills, it is handled at the same time as the fire conversion. First, 60% of physical damage is converted to lightning damage. Then, we have a total of 80% non-skill conversion, which is greater than the remaining 40% physical. The cold and fire conversions are scaled down proportionally to 10% and 30%, respectively, giving 60% lightning, 10% cold, and 30% fire. For one final example, let's say that the 60% lightning and 60% fire conversions both come from skills, while the 20% cold conversion is not from skills. Skill conversion results in 50% fire and 50% lightning, just as in a prior example. Non-skill conversion is handled next, but there is no physical damage left to convert, so the cold conversion is discarded. To summarize the previous batch of examples, scaling conversion down like this only occurs when you attempt to convert greater than 100% of a given stat, by far the most prominent example being physical damage converted to other damage types. If either all or none of this conversion comes from skills, the game preserves the proportions of damage types when scaling the conversion down to 100%. However, if there is a mixture of skill and non-skill conversion, skill conversion is prioritized. This means that conversion listed on skills, such as conversion from Ice Shot or physical to lightning support, is handled before conversion from gear affixes and passives. Gain as extra modifiers are also conversion, but with one important difference. These modifiers don't remove any of the original quantity. Therefore, unlike converted to modifiers, gain as extra modifiers will raise the amount of base damage that you deal. Let's take the modifier gain 30% of physical damage as extra lightning damage, and see what effect it has on the previous examples. Starting without any conversion modifiers, this modifier gives you 30 to 60 lightning damage, just like 30% of physical damage converted to lightning damage. However, unlike the converted to modifier, the gain as extra modifier does not remove this amount from the original base physical damage, so you still deal 100 to 200 physical damage. As proportions of the original base damage, you deal 100% as physical and 30% as lightning. Again, this still counts as conversion, but you can think of it as a lossless conversion. Because gain as extra modifiers don't change the original base damage, they don't interfere with converted to modifiers. Going back to the example with 50% of physical damage converted to lightning damage, including gain 30% of physical damage as extra lightning damage results in 50% of pre-conversion damage as physical damage and 80% as lightning. Lastly, gain as extra modifiers are unaffected by the downscaling that occurs when converted to modifiers exceed 100%. One of the previous examples had 60% lightning skill conversion, 20% cold non-skill conversion, and 60% fire non-skill conversion. This resulted in 60% lightning, 10% cold, and 30% fire after scaling. The gain 30% of physical damage as extra lightning damage modifier is not scaled when combined with this example. All converted to modifiers are applied just like they were before, and the gain as extra modifier acts on the original base physical damage. Therefore, you deal 90% of lightning damage as physical, 10% as cold, and 30% as fire. I don't want to entirely neglect conversion that works on defensive stats. For example, life can be converted to energy shield and/or armor. The conversion mechanics for these defensive stats will function the same way as damage conversion. For instance, let's say you have 1000 base maximum life, 20% of maximum life converted to maximum energy shield, gain 10% of maximum life as extra maximum energy shield, and gain 10% of maximum life as extra armor. Conversion will yield 800 base maximum life, 300 base maximum energy shield, and 100 base armor. I will return to using damage conversion for the following examples, mainly to make things easier to follow. I will revisit defensive conversion in detail toward the end of the video. One potentially unintuitive thing about conversion is how it interacts with global modifiers. By global modifiers, I'm referring primarily to modifiers that use the words increased, reduced, more, and less. The interaction between conversion and global modifiers is particularly confusing if you're used to other games that handle conversion differently. In Path of Exile, when you convert one stat to another, the converted amount is affected by modifiers to both the old stat and the new stat. In other words, base values from conversion inherit the ability to scale with modifiers to the original base values. For example, let's go back to this physical damage conversion scenario, with 50% converted to lightning and 30% gained as lightning. Let's throw in the global modifiers 50% increased global physical damage and 25% increased lightning damage. The unconverted physical damage is affected only by increased global physical damage, but the lightning damage is affected by both increased global physical damage and increased lightning damage. Since they're both increased modifiers, they are additive with one another. Thus, the physical damage is increased by 50%, and the lightning damage is increased by 75%. Since global modifiers are applied after conversion, whenever a single modifier would apply to both the old and new stats, it does not apply twice to the converted amount. For example, let's add a generic 50% increased damage modifier to the previous example. The physical damage is then affected by both increased global physical damage and increased damage, yielding a 100% increase to that portion of damage. The lightning damage that is converted from physical is affected by increased global physical damage, increased lightning damage, and increased damage, and therefore gets a 125% increase. The converted damage does not benefit twice from the generic increased damage modifier, even though that modifier applies to both physical and lightning damage. Keep in mind that the increased global physical damage modifier will only apply to lightning damage if it was converted from physical damage. It has no effect on lightning damage that is not a product of conversion. Let's throw in a modifier that adds 4 to 60 lightning damage. That damage is affected by increased lightning damage and increased damage, but not increased global physical damage. Thus, the 4 to 60 lightning damage becomes 7 to 105 lightning damage. This amount is added to the lightning damage from conversion, for a total of 187 to 465 lightning damage. Your lightning damage will now roll in this range. Separate rolls are not done for each source of lightning damage. Whenever you hit an enemy, only one damage roll is done per non-zero damage type. It is possible to convert stats that have already been converted from other stats. For example, you can convert physical damage to lightning damage, and then convert that lightning damage to cold damage. The twice converted damage is then affected by physical, lightning, and cold damage modifiers. Conversions done in series like this are multiplicative with one another. Let's go back to the scenario with 50% converted to lightning and 30% gained as extra lightning. For this section, I'm just going to use C for converted to and E for gain as extra. I'm also going to stop displaying damage ranges and just use the minimum values. This will simplify the presentation. We'll now introduce more conversion modifiers. 40% of lightning damage converted to cold damage, and gain 10% of lightning damage as extra cold damage. After the 100 base physical damage becomes 50 physical and 80 lightning, the 80 lightning becomes 48 lightning and 40 cold. The lightning damage is affected by physical and lightning damage modifiers, and the cold damage is affected by physical, lightning, and cold damage modifiers. Both portions are affected by generic modifiers, like increased damage and increased elemental damage. At this point, I should take a minute to talk about chaos conversion specifically. In general, converting to chaos damage works just like all other damage conversion. However, the modifier gain X% of non-chaos damage as extra chaos damage is deceptively powerful. You can think of this modifier as 4 separate conversion modifiers, one for each type of non-chaos damage. Similarly, you can think of gain X% of elemental damage as extra chaos damage as 3 separate modifiers, one for each elemental damage type. To illustrate the power of this, let's take the previous scenario and include gain 20% of non-chaos damage as extra chaos damage. From the original physical damage, 50% remains physical, 80% becomes lightning, and 20% becomes chaos. That chaos damage is affected by modifiers to physical and chaos damage. Then, from the lightning damage, 60% remains lightning, 50% becomes cold, and 20% becomes chaos. That chaos damage is affected by modifiers to physical, lightning, and chaos damage. Lastly, from the cold damage, 100% is dealt as cold, and 20% is dealt as chaos. That chaos damage is affected by modifiers to physical, lightning, cold, and chaos damage. Notice that because the 20% extra chaos modifier is actually multiple conversions, chaos damage ends up being more than 20% of total base damage. If you lean more heavily into conversion by fully converting damage multiple times in series and investing more into chaos conversion, you can make chaos damage the overwhelming majority of your base damage. These damage conversion examples are getting really complicated, so I won't do any math with global modifiers in the previous 2 scenarios. If you'd like more detail, feel free to ask specific questions in the comments. I'm happy to do as much math as you want in a comment, but this video is long enough as it is. Now that we've established that conversion can be chained, you should know that conversion obeys a specific order. Notice, for example, that in all the previous damage conversion scenarios, physical damage was always an input to conversion and never an output. Damage conversion respects the following sequence: physical, lightning, cold, fire, chaos. Damage conversion can only ever go to the right and never to the left. The game does not permit, for example, converting fire damage to cold damage, or gaining part of your chaos damage as extra lightning damage. This prevents infinite conversion loops that would break the game. Conversion orders exist for all types of conversion, not just damage conversion. For example, life can be converted to energy shield, which means energy shield cannot be converted to life. Here is a conversion order chart that I believe includes all currently known forms of conversion. I should make a note about certain modifiers in the game that prevent you from dealing certain types of damage. These modifiers do not work the same way as 100% less damage for the corresponding damage types. In some cases, this would entirely break the interaction. Instead, these modifiers apply after conversion, setting any post-conversion damage of the corresponding types to 0. Consequently, you will want to either avoid scaling the corresponding damage types or convert them to damage that you can actually deal. If you have the Avatar of Fire keystone, you convert half your physical, lightning, and cold damage to fire. Since any non-fire damage that isn't converted is discarded, you should try to convert the other half of your base damage to fire to prevent waste. You'll also want to avoid converting to chaos damage, as Avatar of Fire disables chaos damage. This means you should avoid using Edziri's Promise with Avatar of Fire. There's even a wall of shame on PoE.Ninja for high-level characters that do precisely this. Don't be like this guy. In the case of Voidforge, although you can scale physical damage, any physical damage left unconverted will be discarded. If you want to, you may convert this damage to elemental so that it isn't wasted. Also, don't use Edziri's Promise on a Voidforge build, as it also disables chaos damage. While we're at it, also avoid Edziri's Promise on Brutality builds and Doriani's Prototype builds for the same reason. Damage conversion occurs on the attacker side of combat calculations. Therefore, by the time the defender's mitigation would apply, The game no longer keeps track of which portions of damage are products of conversion and which aren't. Let's refer to this scenario, which had some physical to lightning conversion and also some separate lightning damage, not from conversion. After all attacker side calculations, such as global damage modifiers and critical strike calculations, the defender receives a specified amount of physical damage and a specified amount of lightning damage. By now, these two damage numbers no longer contain information about what was converted and what wasn't. The physical damage is affected by any defensive layers that can apply to physical damage, such as armor. The lightning damage is affected by any defensive layers that can apply to lightning damage, such as lightning resistance. Armor will not apply to the lightning damage that was converted from physical, because, again, there is no longer a distinction between damage from conversion and damage not from conversion. This is why damage conversion from zone modifiers, such as map mods and private league rules, can be especially dangerous for characters that excel at mitigating physical damage. Recall that only hits, not damage over time, can be converted. For example, let's say you're using Vortex, which deals cold damage over time. Supporting Vortex with Cold to Fire will have no effect on the damage over time, which will continue to deal its full amount as cold damage and not fire damage. The hit damage, on the other hand, is still subject to conversion. This interaction was commonly used by early Vortex builds, when the Pyre Ring converted 100% of cold damage to fire damage. Because the hit portion of Vortex dealt fire damage, it would cause elemental equilibrium to lower cold resistance instead of raising it. Then, the damage over time portion of the skill would continue to deal cold damage and benefit from the resistance penalty from elemental equilibrium. This interaction no longer works, as Pyre now only converts 40% of cold to fire. The discussion is not so simple when it comes to damage over time from ailments, such as Ignite. Like any other damage over time, ailments cannot technically be converted to other damage types, but they do have some interactions with damage conversion that are less direct. Because damage conversion changes the type of base damage dealt by hits, it also affects your ability to inflict ailments. I don't want to get into every detail about ailment mechanics in the video about conversion, so I'll just jump right into an example. Let's say you have no conversion, and use an attack dealing 100 to 200 base physical damage. The attack inflicts bleeding, which is a damaging ailment that deals 70% of physical damage per second. You also have the following modifiers: 50% increased melee physical damage, 70% increased damage with bleeding, 30% increased global physical damage, and plus 50% to physical damage over time multiplier. The hit damage is increased by 80% to 180 to 360, but we aren't concerned with the hit damage. The bleeding damage is modified separately, being increased by 100% and multiplied by 1.5 for 210 to 420 damage per second. Now let's throw in some elemental conversion and elemental damage modifiers. We'll go with the following: 40% of physical damage converted to cold damage, gain 80% of physical damage as extra fire damage, 50% increased cold damage, 70% increased fire damage, and plus 30% to fire damage over time multiplier. After conversion, your base damage is 60 to 120 physical, 40 to 80 cold, and 80 to 160 fire. Neglecting the hit damage, the base bleeding damage is 70% of base physical damage, or 42 to 84 per second, which becomes 126 to 252 after all damage modifiers. Predictably, converting 40% of physical damage to cold damage has lowered bleeding damage by 40%, since base physical damage is 40% lower than before. This still does not mean that damage over time can be converted. If it could be converted, this bleeding would deal physical, cold, and fire damage over time. Now that you deal cold damage, you are able to inflict chill and freeze. Since these are non-damaging ailments, the effects of these ailments are computed much later in the calculations, after mitigation. Thus, we can't ignore the hit damage here like we did for bleeding, since the hit damage directly affects the associated ailment. First, the 40 to 80 base cold damage is affected by all relevant modifiers, increasing it by 130% to 92 to 184. At this point, this cold damage is treated the same way as any other cold damage when it comes to freeze and chill computations, which, again, happen after mitigation. Since this isn't a video about ailments, I'll spare you the details. Lastly, let's deal with the fire damage, which inflicts Ignite, a damaging ailment that deals 50% of base fire damage per second. In this case, that's 40 to 80 base fire damage per second. Now, importantly, because the base fire damage is converted from physical damage, the subsequent Ignite inherits the ability to scale with generic modifiers to physical damage, such as increased global physical damage. However, it is not affected by increased melee physical damage, because ailment damage is not melee damage. Likewise, it is unaffected by increased damage with bleeding, because Ignite is not bleeding. Also, although the Ignite deals damage over time, and was originally converted from physical damage, it does not count as physical damage over time. Thus, the physical damage over time multiplier has no effect. This may be confusing, as the Ignite scales with physical damage and with damage over time, but not with physical damage over time. All things considered, the final Ignite damage in this scenario is 104 to 208 fire damage per second. There's one more interaction with ailments that technically doesn't have anything to do with conversion, but has some similarities, so I'll go over it anyway. Anytime base damage of one type inflicts an ailment that deals a different damage type, the ailment can be scaled by generic modifiers to the original damage type. By default, the only ailment that works this way is poison. Poison uses your base physical damage and your base chaos damage, but the subsequent damage over time is only chaos damage. Importantly, when you inflict poison with physical damage, that poison is affected by modifiers to physical damage, in addition to being affected by any modifiers that would normally affect poison, such as chaos damage modifiers. Again, this is not damage conversion, as the base physical damage is never converted to chaos, but it does share the property of inheriting global damage modifiers to the original damage type. Although normally poison is the only ailment that can come from a different type of damage, there are many modifiers that allow you to change which types of base damage are associated with which ailments. For instance, Stormfire can make lightning damage Ignite, Volker's Guidance can make elemental damage Poison, and Shaper of Winter can make all damage Chill. For damaging ailments, these modifiers do not change what type of damage is dealt by the ailment. Bleeding always deals physical damage, Ignite always deals fire damage, and Poison always deals chaos damage. However, when a damaging ailment is made to associate with a new damage type, it behaves like poison does when it comes from base physical damage, inheriting generic modifiers to the original base damage. For example, let's say you're playing Fireball, linked to Archmage support, and are wearing Stormfire. For simplicity's sake, we'll say that a level 21 Fireball deals 1200 to 1800 base fire damage, and that Archmage deals 3000 lightning damage. In addition to the 90% more damage with Ignite that comes from the Fireball gem, you also have 300% increased fire damage and 100% increased lightning damage. First, because Fireball has 240% effectiveness of added damage, the 3000 added lightning damage from Archmage is multiplied by 2.4, resulting in 7200 base lightning damage. Thus, total base damage is 1200 to 1800 fire and 7200 lightning. Because of Stormfire, Ignite is then derived from both the fire damage and the lightning damage. 50% of base fire damage is 600 to 900 base Ignite damage per second. This is increased by 300% and then multiplied by 1.9, yielding 4,560 to 6,840 Ignite damage per second. 50% of base lightning damage is 3,600 base Ignite damage per second. Although this portion of Ignite deals fire damage, it can be scaled by lightning damage modifiers. Therefore, it is increased by 400% and then multiplied by 1.9, yielding 34,200 Ignite damage per second. Finally, the two portions of Ignite are added together, resulting in 38,760 to 41,040 fire damage per second. Again, there is no conversion being done in this example. No base damage is changed to another type of base damage. The conversion order is not obeyed by this mechanic because it isn't conversion and can't be chained together. If it did respect the conversion order, it wouldn't be possible, for example, for fire damage to inflict chill, because fire comes after cold in the sequence. In any case, damaging ailments inheriting damage type modifiers is a behavior similar enough to damage conversion that I decided to talk about it anyway. Like non-damaging ailments, any combat calculations that take place after conversion will be indirectly affected by conversion. These include mechanics like stun and leech, which are based on post-mitigation damage, and penetration, which directly affects mitigation. If, for instance, you convert all of your physical damage to fire damage, that damage will be less likely to stun enemies, since physical damage contributes more to stuns than non-physical damage. You will also not benefit from modifiers that leech physical damage as life, because the defender is not taking physical damage. You should instead look for leech modifiers that either specify fire damage or are agnostic to damage type. Fully converting physical to fire will also make modifiers that make you overwhelm physical damage reduction useless, but allow the damage to benefit from fire penetration. Now that you've seen the math, let's more qualitatively discuss why you might invest into conversion in Path of Exile. What are the typical reasons for converting X into Y? The most straightforward reason is that your build simply values Y more than X. For instance, if you use Molten Shell as a major defensive layer, using Iron Reflexes to convert base evasion to base armor makes sense. You may ask why an armor-based build would have base evasion to begin with. One reason is that all characters have some base evasion, which is around 300 for most endgame characters. Other possible sources include the Grace Aura, local evasion on unique armor, and global evasion from ascendancies like Champion or Trickster. What about damage conversion? Why would you value one type of base damage more than another? Damage is damage, right? Usually no. The game provides many incentives to focus on dealing exactly one type of damage. For example, dealing only one damage type allows you to get maximum efficiency out of things like penetration or debuffs specific to certain damage types, like Bone Chill or Wither. There are some ways in which the game tries to reward dealing more than one damage type, such as Trinity Support and Elemental Equilibrium, but these are relatively scarce and often end up being used on single damage type builds anyway. You may also value one damage type more than another because of their associated ailments. For example, converting physical damage to cold damage allows you to inflict chill and freeze instead of bleeding and poison. Bleeding only works with attacks. Both bleeding and poison require specific investment to occur at all, and neither is useful on a build that doesn't scale damage over time. On the other hand, cold damage always inflicts chill, critical strikes with cold damage always inflict freeze, and both are useful debuffs for most builds. Another example of conversion being beneficial for ailments is converting physical damage to fire so that you can inflict stronger ignites. Even if you're playing a build that doesn't particularly value one damage type over another, conversion still has benefits when it comes to damage scaling. For example, converting Cyclone's damage to fire makes fire damage and elemental damage modifiers apply to it. This lets you use both the elemental damage with attacks and melee physical damage support gems, and may enable more efficient skill tree pathing. Another common reason that you might use damage conversion is that you're playing a skill that already converts damage. Frostblades, for example, converts 60% of physical damage to cold damage by default. In general, builds that convert physical damage to elemental try to avoid leaving any amount unconverted. This is true for all of the reasons I mentioned regarding debuffs and scaling, but also because of damage reflection affixes on maps that punish dealing both physical and elemental damage. If your damage is split, you can't run either affix. Converted to modifiers have the obvious downside of taking away the base value from the original stat. For example, converting physical damage to cold damage does come with all of the perks I just mentioned, but it also means you can't use mechanics that reward keeping your damage physical, such as bleeding, impale, brutality support, and pride. Gain as extra modifiers don't have this downside, since they don't take away the original base values. However, there are reasons to avoid conversion that apply to both converted to and gain as extra modifiers. One long-standing example of this is avoiding cold damage on builds that rely on proliferating ignites, as shattering enemies will destroy their corpses and prevent them from spreading ailments. Also, In the same way that elemental reflect mods can punish failing to convert all damage to elemental, elemental reflect mods can punish failing to keep your damage physical. For instance, you might see Herald of Ash as a simple way to boost your damage on an otherwise physical-based build, but using it may make you unable to run elemental reflect maps. This is not an exhaustive list of the benefits and drawbacks of conversion, but it should be enough to get you thinking about what things to consider when deciding if conversion makes sense for your build. Before I end the video, I want to do a few more detailed step-by-step examples. These will reinforce the concepts from earlier in the video and also highlight some interactions that are commonly used but less commonly understood. One skill I personally like to play is Ice Crash. I've played it as a chieftain several times, primarily using the Cold to Fire support gem to convert cold damage to fire. Ice Crash itself converts physical damage to cold damage, so this is a good case study in scaling damage that has gone through multiple conversions. For simplicity's sake, we'll say that your Ice Crash deals 600 to 900 base physical damage in this example. Ice Crash, on its own, converts 100% of physical damage to cold. We pair this with Hatred, which, at level 20, grants gain 25% of physical damage as extra cold damage, and 18% more cold damage. Thus, you deal 125% of base physical damage as base cold damage, which we want to convert to fire damage to take advantage of the Chieftain Ascendancy. Level 21 Cold to Fire support converts 50% of cold damage to fire, and makes you gain 30% of cold damage as extra fire. Converting the remaining 50% of cold to fire can be done in two ways, either Avatar of Fire, or a combination of Pyre and the anomalous version of Cold to Fire support. The difference between these two methods is that Avatar of Fire also converts half of physical damage to fire. There's an apparent conflict here, where physical damage converted directly to fire will not benefit from cold to fire conversion. However, Ice Crash converts 100% of physical damage to cold damage, and this conversion takes precedence over conversion that does not come from skills. Avatar of Fire is not an active skill or a support gem. Therefore, by the time it is factored in, there is no physical damage left to convert, and the physical to fire conversion is discarded. Thus, Avatar of Fire is just as viable a method of achieving cold to fire conversion as is the combination of Pyre and anomalous cold to fire support. Avatar of Fire does have the additional downside of preventing chaos damage, which means Atziri's Promise should be avoided, but this is not build defining. Regardless of which option is chosen, all of the original physical damage goes through both conversion steps. All of the resulting damage is affected by physical, cold, and fire damage modifiers. These include melee physical damage support, Herald of Purity, Hatred, Combustion support, and elemental damage with attacks support. Keep in mind that some things are applied on the defender side of combat calculations and are not passed along through conversion steps. For example, Pride makes enemies take more physical damage, Frost Bomb reduces cold resistance, and Bone Chill increases cold damage taken. Because the enemy takes no physical or cold damage, these will have no effect. However, the Chieftain's Hinakora Death's Fury node provides fire damage leech and covers enemies in ash, increasing their fire damage taken. Both of these things work here, since the enemy is taking fire damage. Let's change up the present example and turn it into an Ignite build. Ice Crash is well suited for an Ignite build because it deals a lot of damage with a single hit, and can benefit from Seismic Cry and Fist of War support. In this example, the base fire damage is used to determine the base Ignite damage. That base Ignite damage is then scaled by global modifiers to physical, cold, and fire damage. This means that even the multipliers on Herald of Purity and Hatred will scale the fire damage over time from Ignite. Perhaps a more clever way to build this Ice Crash Ignite character is not to convert the cold damage to fire damage at all. Instead, you could simply use Hrimburn, allowing your cold damage to ignite. Thus, your base Ignite damage will be derived from both your base cold damage and your non-existent base fire damage. This allows you to replace cold to fire support with a stronger support gem, and enables elemental equilibrium, since you now deal cold damage with the hit, and fire damage with the Ignite. The Ignite damage can be scaled by all the same modifiers as the previous example with the double conversion. There has been a heavy emphasis in this video on damage conversion specifically, so the remaining examples are of defensive conversion. I'm going to start with Iron Reflexes, which converts 100% of evasion rating to armor. Let's say you have 10,000 base evasion rating and 4,000 base armor before conversion. We'll now add in Iron Reflexes, 100% increased evasion rating, 200% increased armor, and 50% increased evasion rating and armor. We'll also throw in a Divergent Determination gem that grants 50% more armor and gain 2% of evasion rating as extra armor. Conversion turns the 10,000 base evasion rating into 10,200 base armor, which is then affected by modifiers to evasion rating and modifiers to armor. Please note that the modifier 50% increased evasion rating and armor is not the same thing as two separate modifiers to armor and evasion. It does not apply twice to converted evasion rating, just like how generic damage modifiers don't apply more than once to converted damage. The same logic would apply to the modifier increased defenses, which affects armor, evasion rating, and energy shield. In this example, since all evasion rating is converted to armor, increased evasion rating, increased armor, and increased evasion rating and armor add together for the converted base evasion rating. Thus, the 10,200 armor converted from evasion is increased by 350%, after which the 50% more armor kicks in, resulting in 68,850 armor from evasion rating. The 4,000 armor that doesn't come from conversion is not affected by the increased evasion rating, but otherwise undergoes the same modifications, giving 21,000 armor. The 68,850 and 21,000 are added together, yielding a final armor value of 99,850. In this example, since evasion is fully converted to armor, it is better to gain 1,000 base evasion rating than 1,000 base armor. This is because, although they both give roughly the same base armor, armor converted from evasion benefits from more global modifiers. Conversely, it is better to get 20% increased armor than 20% increased evasion rating, because that modifier applies to both armor from conversion and armor not from conversion. This logic can be extended to any situation in which you fully convert one stat to another. Generally, you prefer raising the base value of the old stat, but prefer investing in global modifiers to the new stat, all other things equal. Most hybrid life energy shield builds take advantage of conversion to scale their maximum energy shield. For example, the Corrupted Soul Keystone grants gain 15% of maximum life as extra maximum energy shield. Other places to find this stat include Soul Tether and a Veiled Prefix on body armor. Let's say you have 2,000 base maximum life and 500 base maximum energy shield, before conversion. For modifiers, you have gain 35% of maximum life as extra maximum energy shield, 150% increased maximum life, and 100% increased maximum energy shield. The 2,000 maximum life benefits only from the increased maximum life modifier and thus is increased to 5,000 maximum life. From conversion, you get 700 maximum energy shield. This is increased by 250% to 2,450. The 500 maximum energy shield that doesn't come from conversion is increased by 100% to 1,000. Therefore, your final maximum energy shield is 3,450. Conversion from mana to energy shield works in exactly the same way as conversion from life to energy shield, but I still want to highlight the power of using this type of conversion to scale high amounts of energy shield. Let's say that before conversion, you have 2,000 base maximum mana and 1,000 base maximum energy shield. For conversion, you have gain 60% of maximum mana as maximum energy shield, which is most easily achieved by Hierophants with Sanctuary of Thought. You also have 500% increased maximum mana and 200% increased maximum energy shield. The mana is increased by 500% to 12,000 mana. Base energy shield from conversion is 1,200, which is increased by 700% to 9,600. Base energy shield not from conversion is increased by 200% to 3,000. In total, you have 12,000 maximum mana and 12,600 maximum energy shield. I should note that if this conversion is achieved with the help of Sanctuary of Thought, it also comes with a modifier that halves mana costs. I'll leave it up to you to decide for yourself whether Archmage support can still be useful in this scenario, but I personally think it can. Either way, the high maximum mana is great for Arcane Cloak, which is great both offensively and defensively. Another way to use the high mana investment without ruining your energy shield is to use the Power of Purpose Keystone, which converts 80% of maximum mana to twice that much armor. Because of how converted to modifiers stack with gain as extra modifiers, Power of Purpose will significantly lower your maximum mana without impacting your energy shield. Let's insert Power of Purpose into the previous example, along with a global armor modifier. Power of Purpose is unique in that it doesn't do a one-to-one conversion between the two base values. For every 1 base maximum mana lost to conversion, 2 base armor is gained. You can informally think of this as a 100% more modifier that only applies to the armor from this specific instance of conversion. Thus, because in this example you lose 1600 base maximum mana to conversion, you gain 3200 base armor. The mana gained as extra energy shield is still based on the original 2000 base maximum mana. Thus, your post-conversion base values are 400 maximum mana, 3200 armor, and 1200 maximum energy shield. Now we apply the increased modifiers. The 400 mana is increased by 500% to 2400, and the 3200 armor is increased by 550% to 20,800. The energy shield calculations are entirely unaffected. Altogether, you have 2400 mana, 12,600 energy shield, and 20,800 armor. There are more examples I could do, but once again this video turned out longer than I had expected. I do hope that the level of detail is appreciated. I try my best to anticipate every question that people will ask, but maybe some of it is best left for the comments section. If you think there's any follow-up content to this that would be helpful, such as expanding on something I neglected, or some more detailed examples for clarification, please let me know. At this point I'm still undecided on what my next major topic will be. I'm thinking of keeping the scope small for the next one, as these long comprehensive guides are pretty exhausting. If you have any ideas for a smaller topic to tackle, please let me know in the comments. I've gotten a few suggestions so far, but I'm still not sure what I'll do. Thanks for watching.